Okay, in the last lesson, we talked about the Azure Storage services. So we discussed about various storage services, like Azure is going to provide you a storage account, to where we create a storage account in a specific geographical region. So under that, so we have called as a blob storage. Then we have a file shares. Then we have a table storage. Then queue storage. Then we have something called as an SFTP, which can be a feature can be enabled. Okay. Uh, so we'll talk more detail about blob storage today. So first of all, let's understand blob. Terminology sometimes gets a confusion, but let's not make it very complicated. A blob is just any file, any a file. So this can be a text file. This can be an image file. It can be a video file. It can be a log file, etc. You call anything, any file is called as a blob. In Azure a storage terminology, we use a terminology called as a blob. So we can always, when you are reading or going through some articles, they'll be referring to a term called as a blob. But in general, we always call it as a file. But in Azure terminology, it is called as a blob. So what is this advantage of this one? So if you really see a Google Drive or an OneDrive or a Dropbox, so we can upload files into Google Drive or a Dropbox. And for each and every file, there will be an URL. So in the Azure blob, so every blob has an URL, say unique URL. So it's not the folder or something, but every file which we upload or need to store into something has an URL. So if I want to provide access to a specific blob or a specific file, what we call it as we can take the URL of that particular blob and we can share with the respective people or respective users, whoever needs an access to that. Okay. That's what we called as a blob. So every blob is a unique URL which can be used it. So in order to store the blobs, so the blobs are stored in containers. Containers. So what is a container? See, if you really ask me that, so you have a Windows server. On the Windows server or a Windows machine, you have a C drive, D drive, E drive, F drive. So you have a disk drives. So we partition like, hey, C drive, we will have an OS files. A D drive, I'll have all the applications installed in a D drive. And E drive, I'll have my own personal data. Okay, something like this, we organize ourselves. So we create the partitions on the hard disk and label them as C drive, D drive, E drive, and organize our data into these disks. That is the best way of what we call it as. And let's say if the OS has got corrupt, then we can only format, or I would say called as a reinstall the operating system. Still, the data residing on a E drive can be intact and we can work on that. Similarly, containers are something like an organizers, like what we called as a C drive, D drive, E drive. In Azure, we call them as in containers. So a storage account, let's say this is a region. So I'll use the terminology called as a central India as a region. So under this central India region, we have called as an storage account. So on the storage account, I'm giving it called as I would say called as an IT department or something, which we can call it as a storage account name. But let me put it in. I would call it as in department files 01. So I cannot have the capitals. So I'm calling the storage account as an IT department files. So under this storage account, we have called as in containers, what we called as in a container. So we can have containers. Multiple containers can be created under this one particular storage account. So I can have containers created multiple, like how we have a C drive, D drive, E drive, F drive, like we can have multiple drives under this particular one. We can have this particular one. Like this, we can have multiple containers. Each container can be named. So I can call like a project A. The container name also should be in a lowercase, and it can have numerics, but it cannot have a special characters. So containers, I'm saying called as a project B, or a container called as I will say an HR department. A container called as an finance department. Like this, under one single storage account, we need to have a containers in order to store the blobs. The storage account can have a single container or can have a multiple containers. So we can assign permissions to the container or to the blob level. So container is just a logical, I would say, called as a logical boundary for the data, which I would say called as a files or blobs. You can call it as in. So you want to store like a project A data, project A files, and have a different security policies. And you want to have a project B file stored, and you want to have a different security policies. And like an HR department or a finance department, you want to have it. So each and every container can have a different policies. A container can have an individual access policies, and can basically have a life cycle policies, policies. And so life cycle policy is that how long the data can reside if the user is not accessing it. Later we'll talk about it. So in order to store the blobs, we need to have the containers created. So once we have the containers, the blobs or the files are being stored in this particular container. So let's say I'm going to the Azure portal. I'm creating a storage account. I'm creating a storage account called as an Venkat IT department. So I'm creating in South India. I'm selecting a primary service as a blob service. I'm selecting a local replication. Let's say create. Create. So we created a storage account. So under the storage account, when we go to the section called as a data storage and containers, so we would see called as a containers. So by default, whenever we create a storage account, Azure will create one container called as $logs just for these things. And we can create our own containers. So I'm creating a container. I'm giving it called as a project A as a container name, and would say private, no anonymous access. So I'll come back to this. I'll just create a project here. I'm creating one more container. I'm creating another container called as an HR department. Like this, we can create a number of containers under a storage account. So all the files or blobs which are uploaded into this containers will store in a region where storage account is created. So we create a storage account in South India. So this gets stored in this one. Now we have this project A. So I can just open the container. Now we can upload files and do anything. Now under this container, we can create directories if you want, have some directories, or if you want to upload files, you can upload files. So I'm just uploading a file. So I'm uploading one particular file. So this is called as a blob. I'm uploading one more file. Upload a file. You can drag and drop it, or you can browse and you can select the files which you want to have it. Okay, upload it. Now I uploaded 3 different files over here. Now when I click on this social media marketing as a file, you would see URL. Now this is a unique URL generated for this particular file. So I'm just copying this file. I'm going to the another browser. I'm pasting it here. Now it gives a called as a public access is not permitted on this storage account. So why it is showing that public access is not permitted on this storage account? Because the access is not allowed, anonymous. So anonymous access is denied. That is the reason why the user should have permissions in order to access this particular file. So the user should be able to log into the Azure portal or some application before he can do anything. Now, when I'm trying to change an access level, so let's see access level. So we have an access level. So let me take this one. So we have a storage account created in Central India or whatever. So we have access levels at a storage account level and at the container level. So by default, on the storage account level, okay, anonymous access is disabled. So by default, anonymous access is disabled. It means that in order to access the content within the storage account or something containers is by default restricted only to the authorized users is being allowed. So now when anonymous access is being disabled on the storage account, we cannot set permissions on the container level. So anonymous access we cannot enable on this one. So I'm trying to go to the storage account and a project A, change an access level. Now no anonymous access. So for this particular file, I copied this, I set an anonymous access. So it is still not able to access it. So in order to do that one, let's go to the container. I'm changing access level. Let's go to the resource. Go to the configuration. We see Azure Blob anonymous access is disabled. So enable it. Now we enabled an anonymous access at the storage account level first step. Now second level permissions we need to set at a container level in order to do that. Now let me go to a container. Select a project A container as a change access level. As we see, anonymous access to this computer is being blocked because access denied on this storage account. So private no anonymous access is the default. I'm changing it to the anonymous read access. So it is still it's called as a disabled. Let me refresh it. As we have saved settings, still the new settings got reflected. Let me go to the container project A. Change access level. Blob anonymous read access for blobs. So when we enable this, the files which are available within this container can be accessible without any authentication. So anybody can access that as long as they have the URL. So I'm just giving it anonymous read access for blobs only. So that is a read access. So now I have this file. I'm just copying this file URL. I'm going to a different browser where I've not logged into the Azure. I'm simply pasting this particular one. Now we see that I'm able to access the file. Earlier, we were getting an error when anonymous access has been disabled. So we need to ensure that the respective permissions are available, but enabling an anonymous is not recommended, but we need to assign permissions. Now you have a change access level to container for containers and blobs. So when I enable a blob anonymous access, we can only access the blobs which are there in the container, but we cannot get the information about a container, a container. In order to get the information about a container and the blobs available, so we need to set a permission called as a container anonymous read access to the containers and blobs. Then someone from programmatically, they want to get the container information, which is a project A. They can get this information and they can read all the blobs of it. So let me go to the container properties of this one. Let me take this. Let me go to the and paste it here. Obviously called as an resource does not exist. Programmatically, we have to get this information. Okay. So we have to change the permissions in order to get that. So based on need to need basis, you can set it. Now I'm getting a container level access. Still the permissions are not effective. So you can change the permissions based on requirement and other, but most of the times we don't provide permissions. I would say called as an anonymous access is not enabled because of the security risk. But if there is some content which needs to be accessible publicly by anyone, then we can enable called as an anonymous access. Until then, it isn't required. Now we would see called as an within the containers when we go to this one. So when I select the file, now on this one, we can see called as an no. So what are the permissions which we have set now? Now I can set permissions at the individual file level. Okay, based on requirement to requirement, we can basically set the permissions. So if you want to provide access to someone, so we can go to the access control and we can provide permissions on this particular container. Later point of time, so we'll discuss that how we can provide permissions, but okay, we can how we can create the blobs and store the files under this particular blobs. Okay, so this way you can create a blob containers and upload the content into this, and you can access the data. So in the next lesson, we'll talk about file shares. So how we can create a file shares and access map to the virtual machines.